Once upon a time, I thought it would be interesting to look for patterns in how different cultures and languages say things like once upon a time. These kinds of phrases are really common. They appear in loads of languages, some even having multiple. They're used to introduce folk tales and fairy tales, orally transmitted stories that were never really believed to be true. These phrases signal that a familiar story is starting, or at least a story with familiar motifs. It's a ritual phrase that takes the story out of our reality and into a slightly more fantastical world, so you don't need to bother questioning the logic of it. When people listen to music together, their brains synchronize a bit. Being able to anticipate familiar phrases might have a similar effect in storytelling. Patterns and rituals like these are important in making sense of the world. But it's actually pretty hard to find a comprehensive and correct list of these phrases, or information on their history. Which makes sense because they're mostly passed down orally. There aren't that many sources, most of them are from Europe and Asia, and misinformation can spread fast. I've done my best to check the authenticity of everything in this video, and I've put my sources in the description. But sorry if some of these are incorrect, or if I've missed out some interesting stuff. So, there appear to be 5 common types of story opening. Let's start with invoking the storytelling tradition. Gujarati and Hindi have "this is an old story." In Telugu, it's been said over and over and over, so the listener is made aware of their own part in a long ongoing tradition. Some story starters use call and response. In Somali, the storyteller says "story, story," and the audience choruses "tell us a story." In a few Caribbean languages, the storyteller says "creek," or something similar, and the listeners say "crack." These words don't have inherent meanings, but they serve to signal the beginning of a story and to draw the audience in. There's apparently a lot of audience participation in storytelling here, so starting this way sets the stage for collaboration in the rest of the story. The next 3 strategies are all about creating distance between the story and the storyteller. This is probably to do with suspending disbelief. If a story is set in an ambiguous, magical, far-off time and place, then it's easier to just accept it without questioning. First, there's temporal distancing. This is probably the most common type. A lot of languages start their stories with just "a long time ago," for obvious reasons. Then there's once upon a time and its variations. This is one of the few things I could find history for. In English, it first appeared in writing as "once upon a day" in the 1300s, and had become a common story opening by the 1600s. In French, the equivalent phrase was popularised in 1697, when Charles Perrault published a book of fairy tales using it. A translation of that book became popular in Spain, so a translation of the French phrase became popular in Spanish. The German version was spread through the works of the Brothers Grimm. Or at least that's what the Wikipedia pages say in those languages. I couldn't really find a good source, so those origins might themselves be myths. But it is interesting to see the influence of printing. It's possible that widely available printed stories caused the standardisation of just one phrase out of many, while the others, transmitted only orally, have been kind of sidelined. Some phrases play with this standard. In Puerto Rico, storytellers sometimes start with "once upon a time," and twice, which makes thrice. Quite a few refer to a fantastical time. Korean has "when tigers smoked tobacco." Kazakh has "when goats had grey down," and Basque has "when plants and animals could speak." There's also spatial distancing. Malayalam sets stories in a vague "some place," and Bengali stories are "in some country." Many Eastern European phrases share motifs. Polish, Czech, Slovak, Estonian and Lithuanian tales are all set beyond either 7 or 9 mountains, rivers, lakes, valleys or seas. Russian tales are set in the 3/9 kingdom in the 3/10 realm. The numbers used for this usually already have some kind of magical or spiritual symbolism attached. Some phrases use contradictions to distance the tale from reality itself. This is pretty popular both in South and East Europe and Southwest Asia, with languages like Kurdish and Czech both having a phrase that translates to there was and there wasn't. Turkish uses a really long phrase full of contradictions, with things like there was and there wasn't, when I rocked my grandmother's cradle, when fleas were barbers and camels were town criers, with different storytellers using different selections. Ashanti tales are more direct, sometimes starting with a phrase like, we're not saying that what we're about to say is true. And this isn't a specific type on its own, but a large amount of these phrases use rhyming, repetition, or archaic language. Rhyming and repetition are common in oral traditions, because they're easy to remember, and being able to anticipate a rhyme feels good. Archaic language tends to persist in story openers because they're fixed phrases. Upon isn't really used in English anymore outside of once upon a time, and the Russian opening uses a tense that's kind of died out. But they stick around here, both because the phrase has become fossilised, and because old traditional language makes the stories themselves feel old and traditional. At this point, I could finish the video with a happily ever after, but while we're here, let's have a look at happily ever after too. I'd say there are 4 common kinds of story ending. First off, you've got the ones that resolve the story with a ritualised happy ending, like English and they lived happily ever after, or Spanish and they lived happily and ate partridges, which rhymes. Some of these endings reveal traditional attitudes about what a happy ending is, like the French and they lived happily and had lots of babies, or Russian they lived happily and died on the same day. Speaking of death, there are also a few that say something along the lines of, and if they haven't died yet, they're still alive today. Then you have a few that blur the lines between the story and reality. Several Slavic languages end with the narrator claiming to have been there, usually at a wedding, drank some honey and got it in their beard. Romanian has the traditional ending, and I jumped on a saddle and told you the story the way it happened. On the other hand, Irish tales can finish by saying that it's not the teller's fault if it's not true, because it wasn't them who came up with it. Something I found surprisingly common was rhyming nonsense endings. Swedish has snip snap snout, this story's run out. Icelandic has a cat in a bog, Spanish has a red-faced goldfinch, and Dutch has an elephant with a very long snout. These animals are basically only here because they rhyme with a word that means ended. Lastly, some phrases comment on the nature of storytelling. Kurdish stories finish by celebrating their own spread through different households. Bengali's phrase is the story finishes and the goat eats the spinach. Apparently because goats eat the whole plant so it can't regrow. Or in other words, the story is definitely over. But on the other hand, Persian has the story's over but the crow's not home yet, suggesting there are still stories left to be told. Amharic finishes by asking the listener to tell a story in return. A few languages, particularly in South and Southwest Asia, finish by giving out 3 apples, or garlands, or lighting candles as a symbol of thanks. They can be symbolically given to whoever the storyteller chooses, but a common pattern is one for the author, one for the storyteller, and one for the listener. Which I think is a really neat acknowledgement of the different roles involved in storytelling. Because stories aren't separate from who's telling and listening to them, they are created and transmitted and embellished by the relations between people. And same for all of these phrases. So, an apple to all the people through history who passed down these words, an apple to me for making this, and an apple to you for listening.